Hi, my name is Jeff, and welcome to the podcast today. It's good to have you with us. Our guest today is a returning guest, Rabbi Ken Spiro. Ken is a senior lecturer and researcher for Aish HaTorah, Jerusalem, and a licensed tour guide with the Israel Ministry of Tourism. Ken, welcome back.
Jeff, thanks for having me.
Well, of course, we would love to be face-to-face in Jerusalem. However, things are interesting again in the world today, but we're not going to dive too deep into that. Today we're talking about anti-Semitism, its origins, history, and relevance today. And I think the reason we want to sort of pick up on this is that, we feel like this issue of anti-Semitism isn't close to going away. As a matter of fact, it seems to be getting a little bit worse. Would you agree that anti-Semitism is on the rise?
Absolutely. It never goes away. It's the eternal plague of the Jewish people from time immemorial. And it's actually, if you follow the statistics on like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League organization that monitors these things, you'll see that we're reaching levels of anti-Semitism that we haven't seen since the Holocaust. There's spikes. When Israel's involved in like a war in Gaza, it spikes even more. But generally speaking, it's not that it goes down. It stays at a higher level. So it's definitely going up and up, and seeing things in places like North America that have never been seen before, like shootings in synagogues and things like that, which were unheard of years ago and have now unfortunately become quite normal and acceptable.
Wow. Yeah. So definitely higher in comparison with other times in history. Now, we talk about this subject from time to time. We've heard a number of definitions for anti-Semitism. What's yours? Define it for us today.
Well, the word, first of all, the expression was coined by a German Jew hater in 1879. His name was Wilhelm Marr. He wrote a book. Hitler based a lot of his thinking on Marr, and he wrote a book called, in German, it sounds much more, but in English it translates to The Victory of Germandom over Judaism. And in that book, he coins the phrase anti-Semitism, which the dictionary definition is prejudice or hostility towards Jews, and Jews alone, by the way. Interesting point, Jeff, that it's the only form of racial or religious intolerance that has its own word to describe itself. If you hate a black person, what are you? A racist, an Asian, a racist, a Christian? There's no word for it.
Right.
But it seems that Jew hate has to have its own unique word to describe it. So we already have to start thinking there's something unique about this hatred. That's the definition that I use. It's gone through slight, tweaking over the years. In May 2016, there was a human rights definition that's more or less the same, but it's prejudice or hostility towards the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ken, obviously you're Jewish. Have you ever experienced anti-Semitism directed towards you personally?
Interestingly enough, I certainly, in the guise of Israel bashing, I've gotten quite a bit of it online at websites. When I posted like a short version of a presentation I do called Why the Jews, I did like a 10-minute version. And it was shocking. I went up on YouTube and there was like 400 anti-Semitic comments. It was kind of creepy, basically reaffirming exactly what I was saying. In terms of physical threats, thankfully, no. My earliest experience is quite an interesting story when my great-grandmother bought in Brooklyn over like 120 years ago several buildings. My mother and her sister still own one, good real estate investment. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about the 1960s. When I was a little kid, we lived in one of these buildings for a few years, and happened to be, now Brooklyn is a very Jewish area of the United States, especially, even where I used to live. But back then it was all Irish and Italian Catholic. And we used to play. All the kids on the street went to St. Saviour's, a Catholic parochial school. We went to ethical culture school. And I remember we used to play with this kid, Joseph Viglia, my older brother and I. And we'd play in the house with him sometimes, and it was time for dinner. I'm like 5, maybe 6 years old at the time. I think it was about 5. My brother was 7. His mother would say, "Joseph, send the Christ killers home. It's time for dinner." It was kind of shocking. I remember, as one story I always share with people because it's so unbelievable. It was Same Joseph Viglia had his 7-year-old birthday party, and everyone on the block was invited but my brother and I. And he said, let's go see why we're not invited. And I'm like, I don't want to go look. I don't want to see. He drags me down the street. We walk up. He lived one flight up. I am so scared. I'm standing on the stairs with my eyes at the level of the floor. My brother goes, knocks on the door. You can hear all the kids inside. And then it gets really quiet. And then they open the door like a crack, and I can see through, like, all the kids he sticks his head out. The kids are behind him, and the parents are behind him. And my brother says, like, why didn't you invite us to your birthday party? And he says, oh, I ran out of invitations. And my brother's a smart guy today. He's a doctor, you know. My brother didn't believe that. So he throws the door open, and opposite the door was Jesus on the cross. And he yells at my brother, you killed our God. And he slams the door in my brother's face. And I go running home and hide under my bed. I was so scared. I was like, that was my traumatic anti-Semitism moment at like 6 years old. But thankfully, that's about the worst I've suffered through. Oh. I made it to some Islamic Israel hate groups, but nothing more than that. But that was quite an experience that it was one of the vivid moments of my early childhood.
Wow. Well, Ken, I'm really sorry that you experienced that, certainly at the hands of people that call themselves Christians. My definition of Christian doesn't include behavior like that, just so you know. And
yeah, I'm not throwing it at you, by the way. It's not. It just happens to be the experience I experienced.
No, of
course. Had I lived in an Islamic country, I probably would experience something very different.
Right. Now, when you post something online and you get all of this hatred, being thrown at you, you mentioned it kind of proves your point. But as a Jew, how does that make you feel, and how do you make sense of all of that?
Well, I mean, how does it make me feel? It's a little bit scary when you read some of the comments to think that there are people out there that hate you that much. And of course, Jews are not the only people subjected to racial or religious hatred in this world. There are white supremacists who hate black people and black people who hate white people. And so it's not a unique thing, but anyone to know that someone who never had met you hates you to that extent and considers you to be so like incredibly evil or the source of all evil, the world's being destroyed by you and your people is kind of a scary thought. But, we're dealing with anti-Semitism. You have to wade your way through so many different accusations that come from so many different places. And, today, a lot of it is coming from the area of Jewish control of the world, banks, Hollywood, the media, or Israel bashing, which is just anti-Semitism hiding behind Israel bashing. It's your apartheid genocidal war against the Palestinians. But throughout history, if I'd lived in a different period of time, it would have been something very different. Like in medieval Europe, it would have been something related to Christ killers around Easter time, or, poisoning wells or bringing the Black Death to Europe. So the point is, when I happen to be a historian and an author, and I spend a lot of time speaking and thinking about anti-Semitism, so I have a lot of clarity about it. What's probably pretty scary to a lot of Jews, and most Jews are pretty poorly educated Jewishly, not understanding the history of it or understanding what even Judaism is about. It's probably pretty shocking to have thrown at you all of this incredible, like, vitriolic, violent, threatening hatred when you haven't personally done anything to deserve it. It can be a very overwhelming phenomenon, and especially for Jews who have little or no Jewish connection or identity, it could lead to the worst possible reaction, which is, gee, I wish I wasn't Jewish, because look, I'm just being hated. It'd be so much easier if I wasn't part of this people. It's the most hated people in the world. But thankfully, from my personal perspective, I understand exactly what is going on a deeper level. So it's emotionally a little upsetting, but I can deal with it, from a personal level.
Right.
As long as it doesn't physically threaten me or my family, then that would be scary. Absolutely.
No, of course. Absolutely. You coined a word there, Jewishly. I'm going to try and use that in a sentence a few times. I'll practice, see if I can get Jewishly thrown in there. What's the earliest example of anti-Semitism in recorded history? You're a historian, so talk to us about that. Where does this kind of come from?
Well, it is, when Thames Television in England did a series on anti-Semitism like 30 years ago. They called it anti-Semitism, the longest hatred, because it is the longest hatred in human history, and it goes all the way back to the Bible, Jeff.
Hmm.
The best example I can think of is Pharaoh in Egypt.
Sure.
We're reading in the yearly cycle. We're just reading right now. We Jews read through the Bible, the 5 books of Moses every year. We're right at the point, literally, when Moses, before Moses is going to appear. We just finished the book of Genesis, and a new Pharaoh arose who knew not, Joseph nor the deed that he had done for Egypt. And then you see classic anti-Semitic accusation. He basically accuses the Jewish people of being a fifth column. A large, powerful minority that is not loyal and will rise up against us internally, especially when we're being attacked externally, and they have to be dealt with. This is one of the earliest accusations against Jews, completely undeserved in history. Jews happen to be hyper loyal, generally to the host countries amongst whom they live.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the earliest example I could think of for sure, where it's explicitly stated a specific accusation against the Jews, which has been echoed throughout history. Hitler says the same thing. Fast forward, 3,300 years later, and he's more or less accusing Jews of power and control and being a minority in the country that cannot be trusted and is never loyal.
Now, when people talk about anti-Semitism today and try to explain why is it here, what are some of the explanations that people give for why it exists, and are they legitimate reasons in your estimation?
In my opinion, no. Some of them have a teeny taste of something that could sort of make sense, like the one that a lot of people get now is they're jealous of us, or Jews are so successful disproportionately. It's true. Jews are high income earning, well-educated, disproportionately successful people,
Mm-hmm.
highly concentrated in any number, in Hollywood for sure, in the media, and definitely. A lot of it's exaggerated, like banking. Jews do not control the world's banks by any, the Rothschilds being the one exception of a Jewish banking family, but generally speaking, it's not the case. But when you look at these accusations, you see even poor Jews are hated. When you go back 1,000 years ago to medieval Europe, when the vast majority of Jews had no political, disenfranchised completely, had no rights, were not citizens, were deliberately impoverished and economically marginalized, they're hated just as much. No matter what shape the Jewish people twist themselves into, we are powerful, weak, dominant, lazy, servile, aggressive, rich, poor. We're all accused of all these things, even at the same time sometimes. Professor Michael Curtis of Rutgers University, he had a great line. He said, anything and everything is a reason to hate the Jew. Whatever you hate, the Jew is that. So when we decide that when we're different, like in medieval Europe, when it was Christendom, when Europe was basically, even a lot of countries in Europe that exist today, like Germany, Italy, did not exist 1,000 years ago, or even 200 years ago, barely. When we were different, we were hated for being different. And then when we try and assimilate, ironically, like in Germany, no one was more German than German Jews who went out of their way to assimilate, even converting, changing their names, doing anything they could. Then you get even greater explosions of anti-Semitism, which, think about it, Jeff, that is really illogical, because the main reason that one group hates another group is dislike of the difference.
Right.
You're black, I'm white. The more you become like me, if you're black, you can't really change that, but the more you become like me, the less you should be hated until you assimilate. That works for everyone but the Jewish people. The fact that the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism, beginning with Egypt, where we're told very specifically Jews were just like Egyptians after multiple generations, like 100 years of living there, they became just like Egyptians. The greatest explosions of anti-Semitism have happened precisely in places where Jews are most like the non-Jews and most loyal to the countries amongst whom they lived, which has got to get us thinking there's something not normal about this hatred. There's something much deeper going on. So the trick is not to get, it's a smokescreen, not to get distracted by that, but to try and keep our eyes on what's really going on, which has, of course, huge implications for Jews in terms of understanding who we are and what we're supposed to be doing. And also it has huge implications for the world to understand what's really driving anti-Semitism.
Right.
When that becomes clear, then the implications are universal.
Wow. So if these reasons are not legitimate or even logical, as you say, then let's get to the heart of it. What is the true cause of anti-Semitism, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I do this as a whole presentation where I literally knock off all of the excuses of like, again, rich, poor, dominant, lazy, servile, weak, great numbers, teeny tiny minority. You push them all aside. Some of them have little, again, a little bit of taste of something that seems to make sense, like, Jews being disproportionately, like I said, powerful in certain industries, like the entertainment industry. By the way, those Jews are completely disconnected from Judaism. They never used their Jewish head with Jewish ideas to try and influence the media Jewishly or in any way like that. It's always, it's never that. But when you knock all of those things aside, bottom line, the way I like to explain it is, and I often quote Hitler, and Hitler is someone, we make a mistake with Hitler. We, write him off as being crazy. He may have been a little more neurotic than most people, but to do great things in this world, whether it's great good or great evil, you have to have a lot of potential. Hitler's definitely evil, but he's a man of great potential. You can't do what he did without having a lot of drive and vision and leadership skills and speaking ability. So to write a guy like that off as crazy is a mistake. And to not take a guy like that serious is a bigger mistake. It happens to be that totalitarians tend to be more ideologically consistent than leaders in democratic countries, precisely because they don't have to worry about being reelected. If you don't like what they say, they have you killed. Right. So Hitler Hitler says a lot of things about the Jews, but forgetting all the quotes, I just want to quote the words of the Hitler Youth Song, which is what all the kids in Germany are singing between 1933 when Hitler comes to power and April 1945 before he puts a bullet in his head in his bunker in Berlin at the end of the war. Listen to the last 7 words of the Hitler Youth Song, because it's right out there, yet no one pays attention to it. The song goes like this: "We are the joyous Hitler youth. We don't need any Christian virtue. Our leader is our savior," meaning Hitler. "The Pope and Rabbi shall be gone," and here it comes, "we want to be pagans once again." Unbelievable. That's the words of the song. Wow. We want to be pagans once again. Dennis Prager wrote an incredible book called Why the Jews. It's the same name as the presentation I give, coincidentally. No connection. It came out the same year. But I think it's the single best book ever written about the why of anti-Semitism. And I actually want to read you the quote. I have it in front of me, but I could paraphrase it. But he says it so beautifully. When people ask me to sum up anti-Semitism in the words of someone else, this is the shortest way I've ever heard it summed up beautifully. It says, "From its earliest days, the raison d'être, the reason for being of Judaism, has been to change the world for the better. This attempt to change the world, to challenge the gods, religious or secular, of societies around them, and to make moral demands upon others, has constantly been a source of tension between Jews and non-Jews. We now understand why so many non-Jews have regarded the mere existence of Jews, no matter how few, as terribly threatening. The mere existence of Jews, with their different values and allegiances, constituted a threat to the prevailing order." Hitler says something else that's interesting, Jeff. He says, the Jews put two scars on humanity: conscience on the soul and circumcision on the body. And they're both inventions of the Jew. And in my opinion, that's the greatest backhanded compliment ever given to the Jewish people. And by the way, the first people to go after circumcision were the Greeks in the Hanukkah story, which we just celebrated. Hanukkah and Christmas usually come out pretty close together. Right. This year, Hanukkah was several weeks before. But Hanukkah, which is actually history's first religious ideological war. It's in the ancient world, everyone was a pagan, just variations of the same themes. They swapped gods like baseball cards. Every culture had an idea of what was right and wrong, what you could do, and ethics and morals, but it was based on whatever the society deemed was acceptable, what you perceived the different gods wanted. Into that world comes Abraham, and who creates a family that makes a nation called the Jewish people. And they'll be the only people for 2,000 years until the birth of Christianity who will believe in one God and one absolute standard of morality. And the notion that morality is not a popularity contest, what we decide is right and wrong, has nothing to do with expedience or what the majority wants, but what the infinite creator of the universe says is good and evil in an absolute standard. And that has always bothered a lot of people for a long period of time, especially totalitarian dictators who we would consider evil today, who, wanting to do something that goes against those ideas, recognize that the source of those ideas and their greatest opposition is going to come from this teeny tiny people who's today 0.2% of the world's population, who even when they're not connected Jewishly are always pushing a Jewish agenda. Jews are obsessed, even secular Jews, with this idea of tikkun olam, of fixing the world. We never conform. We're always outside the box. Abraham was unique because he was a radically transformative thinker who had a lot of chutzpah, which is a great Hebrew word for gumption. He was audacious. He wanted truth regardless of consequences. And he was going to push and yell and scream against the entire world. And the Jewish people did that for 2,000 years until finally, out of Judaism will come the great monotheistic offshoots, which are Christianity and Islam, which are going to convert billions of people who used to be a bunch of kind of amoral polytheists into a worldview that's essentially Jewish. And throughout history, whenever someone's come along and wanted to go against that, they've always recognized that, Hitler said it too. He goes, to get rid of Christianity, I just got to kill the Pope and burn down some churches, and the Christians will go back to being pagans. To get rid of communism, which he calls both those things the bastard children of Judaism, by the way.
Wow.
And it's true. Communism and socialism were invented by misguided Jews, Marx and people like that. So to get rid of communism, just kill Stalin, kill the commissars. But to get rid of the mother of the bastard children, you can't just kill rabbis and burn down synagogues. Every Jew has within him or her this little Jewish soul. And if one little Jew survives, this is exact quoting him. He said, without any synagogue or any Hebrew school, it's in his soul. Which is why Hitler has a unique relationship with the Jews, which is every single Jew has to be gassed and then incinerated. Because if one of them survives, like a virus, that Jewish soul is going to spread throughout the world, start spreading these ideas against everything I want to do, and reintroduce what he called the human concept back into humanity, of loving your neighbor and taking care. He said, nature isn't like that. Nature is brutal. Lions don't show mercy on the sick and the babies. But that's balanced. The strong stay strong, the weaker lunch. He says the Jew is destroying the world because he's introduced this ideas of loving your neighbor and social responsibility and taking care of the poor and the weak. You have to watch the presentation I did, World Perfect, on the impact of monotheism and morality to see how incredibly violent and callous and brutal the ancient world was, even the most sophisticated civilizations like Greece and Rome. Infanticide, slave-based economies, constant warfare, inequality, injustice, the entire, basically, we call it bucket list of values of Western liberal democracy comes directly or indirectly from the one God, the Jewish people, and then spreading throughout the world through Christianity, through the ideas of the founding fathers, of people in America who firmly believed, like it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident in the Declaration of Independence of America, that all men are created equal. These are fundamental ideas. So when evil comes into the world, it's always going to target the Jewish people first.
Wow, that's profound. And so, first of all, I say, thank God for the Jewish soul, because it has informed so much of what we understand about, law and order and respect and right, all of those kinds of things. And so, what I'm hearing you say is that this driving force, at least behind the anti-Semitism of Nazi Germany, was to eradicate anything that would remind them of what they're doing wrong. If I'm capsulizing that right, none of us like to be told when we're doing something wrong. And I think they would have to sort of admit that they know it in their heart of hearts, but anybody that reminds them of it, that hatred would be the sort of the driving force to rid themselves of that. So tell me if I'm not getting that right. That's just a real huge kind of summarizing statement, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. First of all, I'm not saying Jews are all right and perfect. There's bad Jews in the world, man. Misguided Jews, because of their drive and their radical thinking, can be very destructive people, like Ivan Boesky, Michael Milken, Jeffrey Epstein. That's not the issue here at all. We're talking about a much more deeper sort of holistic philosophical issue. And it's not just Hitler, by the way. You'll notice in modern history, like a person like Stalin, the Soviet Union was very threatened by the teeny tiny minority of the country that was Jewish. And it's not a physical threat. There's a very deep understanding that Jews are always going to be screaming and never accepting when this stuff comes into the world, even the ones who aren't really connected Jewishly. Jews in Germany, Jeff, are only 0.6% of the population of Germany. 0.6%.
Wow.
Disproportionately impactful, in terms of retail and Nobel Prizes in Germany, but still definitely not a physical threat. Few and far between, however, are the people who see this clearly and say it openly. The average person who hates Jews has bought into the propaganda and the lies. Yeah, they're killing Palestinian children and harvesting their organs, or they're controlling the world's economy and polluting the world with online gambling and prostitution and and whatever else they're doing, controlling the banks. And these are not the truths, but most people believe that. But we have to, like I say, as a good doctor has to never be distracted by the symptoms and understand what the real deeper disease is. Otherwise, you're never going to heal the patient properly. And that's the thing to focus on. And that's the point that so few people really see, that collectively, the mission of the Jewish people, we've been dragging the world kicking and screaming for thousands of years towards a vision of one God and one absolute standard of morality, one destiny for the human race. And anti-Semitism, regardless of whatever form it hides behind, is always going to be, on the deepest level, a rebellion against that national historic mission. Which is, by the way, very important for Jews to understand, because otherwise we spend all the time commemorating the past and looking back, or always trying to explain how all these symptoms are not true. Like apologetics, as we call it, rather than focusing on what the real battle has to be in terms of what the Jewish people's mission in the world is and how we truly eliminate anti-Semitism. It's not by creating a checklist of all things we're accused of and proving historically they're wrong. That's the person who hates us. That's not going to convince a lot of people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The argumentative side of people, I think, always wants to have that discussion. But, we talk about this all the time. Somebody that's sort of convinced against their will remains unconvinced still. But I understand. Exactly. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Now, what are some of the manifestations of anti-Semitism in our world today, like current day? And is it always clear to sort of see it, or are there some subtleties that we sometimes, miss?
Yeah, so the number one manifestation of anti-Semitism today is Israel bashing. It's, and again, it's a very important thing to understand when we, every country in the world is legitimate to criticize any country in this world. Israel is not immune from criticism. We live in the worst neighborhood in the world, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, and free market, multiracial, ethnic, religious country. But Natan Sharansky, who is a former prisoner of Zion in the Soviet Union, now former cabinet minister in Israel, very famous refusnik during the Soviet Jewry movement, he had a great point. He had the 3 Ds: what separates legitimate from illegitimate criticism of Israel, which means what separates legitimate criticism of Israel from just anti-Semitism hiding behind Israel bashing. And he said number one is delegitimization. When you basically say the Jewish people have no right to a country, you deny their right. Number two is demonization. When you accuse Israel of ridiculous things, like I said, of being an apartheid state when it has 20% of the population are Arabs and they live in a democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East, or we're harvesting Palestinian organs to sell on the international market, that kind of stuff. And the third, which is the real dead giveaway, is the double standard.
Right.
When you ignore everything else going on in the Middle East, like what Assad is doing, in Syria, killing 750,000 of his own people and making another 6 million refugees, and ignoring that, and the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly ignores this stuff and obsesses the fact that there are more. The UN has passed more declarations, more what's the word I'm looking for? I'm just went right out of my head. More resolutions, condemning Israel than every other country in the world combined in the last 40 years. Is insane. Yeah. So a lot of it hides behind that. How it's anti, and if it only affected Israel, that would be one thing. If people were only standing outside the Israel consulate in New York and in London screaming, stop the genocide against the Palestinian people, okay, it wouldn't be true, but it would still be understandable. But when you have cars driving down in May, we had a little mini Gaza war for 11 days. You have driving through Jewish neighborhoods in London, Arabs with loudspeakers screaming out the windows, murder the Jews and rape their wives. You can see this on YouTube, these videos. Or people being attacked, sitting in a restaurant in LA on the street, and people kind of just punching them. You understand that we're all lumped together in this, and it switches very quickly from what Israel's doing to, Hamas give the Jews the gas, which is what you hear people screaming in rallies in Amsterdam, that kind of stuff. So that's the number one manifestation of it today, and it's being led primarily by radical Islamic groups, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And a huge part of the Islamic world harbors pretty nasty attitudes towards Jews. Not all, I'm not saying that's everyone. And you have a really terrible, what's called the Red-Green Alliance today, where the left, the political left in the world, which has always viewed anti-Semitism as the disease of the right. The right is always the nationalist, fascist people, whatever. The reality is the greatest explosion of this you see now is this alignment of, the only thing they agree on, by the way, the hard left, which is pro all of these LGBTQ things and all this other stuff, which is completely anathema to Islam, which is a very conservative, particularistic worldview, whereas the left is very universalistic and open to everything. They would hate each other normally, except the one thing that they unify on is we both hate Israel. It's the intersectionality of this has made it very lethal and very nasty, which is why on university campuses you get, which are very woke and left-wing, you get a lot of alliance between the Islamic movements on the campuses with the left, and they're coming after the Jewish students who have nothing to do with Israel. Some of them never been to Israel, have no idea about their Judaism, completely disconnected, but they're going to be the targets. I just saw an article that insane number of Jews on campus. It's like close to 80% are scared on campus of expressing, letting people know they're Jewish. On an American campus, I'm not talking about going to Al-Quds University in the West Bank. I'm talking about. So it's a very scary thing, especially for these Jews who don't even know what Judaism is about. You're going to be hated, not even have any pride in your mission in this world and what you've done and what you're supposed to be doing is probably the worst byproduct of all of this.
Yeah. Some of the more subtle things, of course, like BDS and the media bias that we see, always when any of the reports come out about some of these conflicts, also feed into all of that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And you have things like Ben and Jerry's ice cream, which is two incredibly woke left-wing Jews from Vermont, who they'll sell ice cream to China, where they got 1 million, Muslims in concentration camps there. They have no problem Ben and Jerry's there, but in Israel we can't sell. This is even more. The self-hating Jews are some of the most dangerous people. A guy like a George Soros, who's I'm sure a very well-intended human being, but is behind all of the hardcore left-wing NGOs that are undermining Israel constantly. And so it's not something limited just to non-Jews. It's a very deep, contagious, viral, I don't know if you know these COVID-related words, sickness that always seems to spread. And even when you get rid of one manifestation of it, it just emerges in another way. Like you have the Omicron now, you had the Delta before. We hated Jews for this. Now we hate them for that. But again, it's all circling around. But Israel's definitely, I always say Israel's the final form that really malignant anti-Semitism is taking as we approach the big showdown, end of days kind of scenario, which seems to be not too far on the horizon. But it's also really important, Jeff, that we realize that it's not just a Jewish thing. There's the implications of anti-Semitism are huge for the world at large, because what it says a lot about values. There's a guy by the name of George Gilder, not Jewish at all. He said when he was younger, he had sort of anti-Semitic attitudes a little bit. But he wrote this book called The Israel Test. And he talks about how people's attitude towards Israel is a reflection of their own values and what it says about you. I say it's not an accident. I always point out that take the countries that are the biggest Israel bashing countries, like Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba. You notice something in common with these countries? I mean, some of them are complete communist secular countries, and some of them are radical Islamic particularist countries. But they all have one thing in common. They're all totalitarian dictators that have very little tolerance, no freedom.
Right.
And so it's interesting what it says about the countries that most support Israel, the people that most support Israel. It says a lot about your own values. So Gilder, actually, I have the quote here. He says, the central issue in international politics, dividing the world into two fractious armies, is the tiny state of Israel. The prime issue is not a global war of civilizations. The real issue is between the rule of law and the rule of leveler egalitarianism, between creative excellence and covetous fairness, between admiration of achievement versus envy and resentment of it. Israel defines a line of demarcation. As with America, so with Israel. Israel is not a dispensable Jewish best friend, a noble but doomed democracy, or even a charitable dependency we can no longer afford. It is an indispensable ally, and in the past 20 years, it has evolved into perhaps our most valuable partner. Yet for most Americans, ultimately, our loyalty to Israel arises not from a cold calculus of survival, but from a sense of the holy. What Americans must fathom with both heart and mind is that this instinct is true and vital to our survival, that if we would live, we must defend the Holy Land. And what he's pointing out is a point that I always make, which, the Iranians used to call America, they still do, America is the great Satan, Israel is the little Satan. I always say Israel is the source, and America is the symbol of the foundational values of Western liberal democracy, which are the Judeo-Christian ethics. Like I said, spread through Christianity, spread through modern liberal democracy. So an attack against the countries that also hate Israel, the countries, of course, hate America, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, that kind of thing. So it's so important as a wake-up call that we recognize that even though they might not be able to say it openly and what they're really going after, and they might call us a Satan and a big and little Satan, this is the real issue. It's all about the core values, which is why, flip it over, you see that who are the biggest friends of Israel today? That part of the evangelical Christian community that recognizes the biblical roots of Christianity and recognizes the prophecy within the Bible. That God says to Abraham, I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and recognizes how much of what is core to Christian values, including Jesus himself, comes from Judaism. And without that, you have nothing. There would be no Christianity. There'd be none of those values. Right. So for Christians, and I always talk, you talk about Catholics who are not real Christians. The Catholic world, that didn't even pay lip service to the Bible in medieval Europe to the extent, and that's the big plus of the evangelical community in my experience. These are people who take the Bible extremely seriously, a lot more serious than a lot of Jews I know, sadly. And when they and because of that commonality of vision and values and the recognition that God is at the center of our existence on a spiritual and a moral level, that makes us natural allies in the struggle. We have things we disagree on theologically. Right. But I can say, and I'll say this openly, I find it a lot easier, unfortunately, today to even have discussions with a lot of, my Christian friends than some of my Jewish friends and family who are very, have a Jewish soul but no Jewish software, and are just, they don't have any of this understanding. Right. And on a lot of the core issues, I would get along with a Christian and agree with a Christian far more politically and morally than, unfortunately, some of my Jewish friends and family who are wonderful human beings, but just very poorly educated and very disconnected. Yeah. So it goes back to such an important point that your audience has to recognize that it's a real fight over an ideological a vision of how we want the world to be. And what it's going to be based on, what values, what principles, what spirituality.
Wow, that's all so good. I do want to clarify one thing. I didn't mean to say that all Catholics are not real Christians. I was specifically referring to the ones that you encountered as a boy. I do believe that many in the Catholic Church would be supportive of Israel and want to sort of express that. But of course, there are some ideological differences between Catholics and evangelicals as well, which, we, again, try to be able to have good dialogue. And I think that's always so important. Guidon Ariel, who we've had on the show, he said to me, he said his sort of mantra is, I can have dialogue with anybody, but I draw the line at somebody who wants to kill me. So, that we want to be able to make sure that we have good open communication in that sense.
Yeah, that's true. By the way, I have to also the Catholic Church has gone through a lot of changes, certainly from what it was initially, replacement theology, till today, and Pope John Paul was the big changer of that. Vatican II, which, by the way, my story I told you was like 1964, 65, right around Vatican II. That's when this happened to me. And that's when Pope Paul came out and change. It was the first major step towards Judaism reconciliation and dropping the prayer about the perfidious Jew that used to be in Catholic liturgy, and then you have John Paul 2000, recognizing Israel. Certainly I wasn't blanket. I'm just saying historically Catholicism has a lot of negativity, and accusations of Christ killer especially medieval Europe, were triggered a lot of anti-Jewish violence. For sure, absolutely.
So Ken, you mentioned,
but I wanted to. Sorry,
I was going to say you mentioned our audience, and I want you to tell our audience, what as Christians, what is the best way that we can sort of help to combat this? What are some maybe practical tips that you can give people who are listening, watching, to really help to combat anti-Semitism in our world today? Right.
So first of all, the number one thing is to wake up and realize it's like a kind of a universal problem. I normally don't read quotes when I speak, but there's so many good ones. I just wanted to share with you one more quote, which is in the end of Dennis Prager's book on Why the Jews. He has a little thing addressing non-Jews in the book. And this is really the messaging that I think is so important that anyone watching this hears. And then I want to just add a little comment of my own. He says, anti-Semitism is a Jewish problem, but non-Jews make a most self-destructive error when they dismiss it as only the Jewish problem. Treatment of Jews has served as one of humanity's moral barometers. He calls the Jews the canary in the coal mine, by the way. The canary gets affected first before the miners. Watch how a nation, religion, or political movement treats Jews, and you have an early and deadly accurate picture of that group's intention towards others. Moral non-Jews who fail to act against anti-Semitism inevitably suffer from them. Nothing about Jew hatred is clearer than this. Jew haters begin with Jews but never end with them. As anti-Semitism is ultimately a hatred of higher standards, so long as there are good people, the Jews will never be the only targets of anti-Semitism. Moral non-Jews who do not heed the universal implications of this hatred are destined to be its victims. So that's like the fear factor. That's the wake-up call. But in terms of what people can do on a personal level, there's no question. Go hug a Jew. Obviously, no, it's very important. First of all, it's very important to reach out to Jews. There's a lot of fear in the Jewish world of especially evangelical Christian community. There's a lot of fear from the liberal side of the Jewish world that it's all about these guys are all like MAGA kind of guys. They're all these fanatical, religious, super conservative, right wing, like this, and they're going to take away our rights and whatever, which is all misplaced and nonsensical. And it comes from a lack of interaction because most of these Jews have never interacted with like evangelical Christians in any way. They certainly socially don't hang out with them. So it's one thing is just interact with people and break down the barriers so that these Jews see us that way. From the religious, by the way, Orthodox Jews, it's all about they just want all the Jews to come back to Israel so the Messiah will come and it'll be Jesus. And I always say the same thing. First of all, fine, we'll leave that debate till the end, and if he comes, then we'll know the answer. But I'd much rather have people who support Israel than the ones who are burning crosses outside my house or expelling me or accusing me of being a Christ killer. We'll leave that debate till the end. So I on my end, I'm always trying to break down the barriers, both within secular Jews who are disconnected and more liberal, and within very religious Jews to try and recognize that we have a lot in common. But I think it's very important that Christians watching this make an effort, to make sure that to build relationships with any Jews they come across, let them know, give them a little sense of what they're thinking about in terms of their view and why, if they support Israel, why Israel is important to them. They need to hear it directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But it's just very important that we don't leave fighting anti-Semitism up to just Jews. That when, God forbid, something happens in a community, that Christians need to come out in solidarity and support, the way Jews come out, by the way, always. We always come out. Jews are always for every ism, usually, but Judaism. They'll show for everything, That's extremely important. And also supporting Israel is extremely important, but to also make sure that we correct the lies and the disinformation.
Yes.
Edmund Burke, who was a famous British parliamentarian who defended America during the American Revolutionary War, he said, it's one of the great quotes. He said, all it says for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And if non-Jews recognize that attacks against Israel are basically attacks against their values also, then the most important thing is to wake up and stand up. And whether it's writing, whether it's coming to a rally, whether it's writing a member of parliament or a congressman or a congresswoman, whatever needs to be done and never letting, when editorials, things come out in the media, it's very important. We've seen that this works very effectively. When lies come out in the media, half-truths, falsehoods come out, you got to write letters in, call the editors, bombard them with and there's organizations like CUFI, Christians United for Israel, and whatever people can do. The most important thing is just not to do anything, and never to think. This is just a rule about human beings. Never think, who am I? What can I do? Because the ability to change the world is always a combined effort of everyone working together. And by being proactive and not standing there passively and watching, because Judaism, by the way, says that, when you're confronted with evil, the minimum you can do is you have to leave. You can't stand by and watch. It's like if you're not in Germany, you feel you can't do anything. You can't stay in Germany. You're responsible. You're guilty by association. Ideally, you oppose it if you can do something to oppose it. But to do nothing is to make you part of that problem, not part of the solution. And if you're part of the problem, then the problem's going to come in and bite you in the end also. It might start with me, but it's going to come to you. There's a guy by the name of Niemöller, a German Christian thinker from around World War II, and he has a great quote, Martin Niemöller. He says, when they came for the trade unionist, I didn't protest because I wasn't a trade unionist. When they came for the communist, I didn't protest because I wasn't a communist. When they came for the priest, I didn't protest because I wasn't a priest. When they came for the Jews, I didn't protest because I wasn't a Jew. And then he said, when they came for me, there was no one left to protest. And that's really the issue. I know from my perspective, I'm doing all I can as an outreach guy and an author and a speaker to wake Jews up to the beauty and positive meaning and message and destiny of the Jewish people, rather than the fear factor. I always spin anti-Semitism over on it's upside down and try and show people that when you understand what's really causing it, it's a huge empowering message of us as a people unifying and using our potential and our drive to complete the mission that Abraham started thousands of years ago. And when I speak to non-Jewish audiences, it's basically the same message, that all of us who believe in a God, an absolute standard of morality, and certain values that are unchangeable and immutable and eternal and universal, that we all have to stand up together for them and unite around that. And that's the real struggle going on in the world today, that the world is dividing between more than anything else. It's not radical Islam in the West. It's between people who have that worldview and people who, one way or another, are denying that worldview.
Well, thank you, Ken. These are just incredible words, and I think they'll be super helpful for people who are listening, people who are watching. And I encourage you, if you're listening, watching, please take them to heart. And I also, hope that, as Christians, we're people that believe in prayer, and we ask, would you just pray for Israel, pray for, for Ken and for others who are sort of holding up the standard and helping to get the word out. And I think that it's just so critical that we do that. These are the things we believe in, and if we believe in these things, then we should be actively praying for the peace of Jerusalem, as the psalmist instructed. So.
100%.
Ken, thanks for being with us again today. Now, if people want to find out more about you, give them your website address so that they can go and learn more about your stuff.
Sure. I have a lot of content online for free. You can listen, read, and watch. You can also contact me through there with comments, questions. It's Ken Spiro, KenSpiro.com. Very easy to remember.
Thanks for watching. You can listen to this entire podcast on your favorite audio podcast platform. Find the link below. And while you're at it, don't forget to click subscribe and follow us on Facebook so you can stay connected to First Century Foundations.